All right, so good morning, everyone. It's November 1st. It is All Saints Day, which is, as everyone knows, is also when daylight savings time ends, as has been for about 10 years or so. Um, this is the Faith Function class. Uh, you're being recorded. Um, these class videos go online on YouTube, youtube.com/user/idlewildprez, which is also maybe where Sunday morning church will be. We're not sure. Rick, over to you.
Um, yes, well, good morning. It's good to have everybody here. Yes, Daniel mentioned, we're told that it probably a 99% probability that we will be on YouTube for services this morning, beginning 11:15. And an email is supposed to go out to the congregation about that with the link to make it as easy as possible. And good, Daniel just put in chat
Yeah, that's
the link to the YouTube channel.
yeah, that's the church's YouTube channel where all these classes are. I think most Sunday services, the other Sunday school class, and maybe not the Sunday services, but a lot of the other stuff, time with the younger church, all that. So
And Daniel, before we exit, make sure we repeat the reminder for those
yeah,
who come in
hopefully
late.
we'll know.
Um, okay, well, it's great having everybody here on All Saints Sunday. When it's not very often we actually have All Saints on Sunday on All Saints Day. And this year, I don't know, it seems terribly appropriate because of the loss that we have all experienced as a community, as individuals this past year, and all the saints that have joined the communion that we hold dear. Are there any announcements to be made? Well, one thing I want to say, there is a Tuesday, of course, is the end of the election season. And at 6:30 in the morning, there will be a time of prayer. You can find the link on your newsletters and then on the website as we enter the final day of voting for this year, and then we enter one way or the other a new period. Any other announcements? Joys and concerns? I have one. My aunt, my only aunt, passed away with COVID-19 on Friday, and her husband, who is my only uncle, also has COVID-19, though he's not hospitalized at this point. Their only surviving son, to having been lost in separate horrific traffic accidents, had COVID-19, as well as his wife, but they have recovered. So it's a tough time that we can't, like so many families, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of families, cannot embrace. Be it, my uncle being quarantined and my father in a lockdown and assisted living facility. It's tough, and I know so many are going through this. Also want to lift up healthcare workers who are fighting this day after day. For example, my son-in-law, who fled COVID-19 New York City at its peak, afraid for his family, taken them to upstate New York to his community hospital, and thinking he had escaped, but get caught up with them, and they're going through the same same problems and issues that he had in New York City. Smaller, but just as intense. His having served in Afghanistan and Iraq and being a victim of PTSD, he says that's what the hospital staffs are suffering. We're seeing deaths after death. So remember those folks as well. Any other joys or concerns? Let's go to God in prayer. Oh God, you made us a gift of your Son, whose life and ministry exemplified the way to love and indeed embrace mercy, justice, and forgiveness. However, we often lose our way by overt commission as well as by neglect of those who hurt and are in need. May we never forget the communion of saints who have been taken from us, or those who were left behind, especially during these ravages of a pandemic. But we also never forget those healthcare workers who are in the front lines, selflessly putting themselves and their loved ones at risk to care for those who need them. But we also honor those who have given their comfort, their blood, and their lives, so that we all have the freedom to speak our own minds and have a voice in choosing our leaders. And may we do so by ever exercising that right. In the name of the one whom we have vowed to follow, amen. We are delighted to have Jim McClanahan, a member of our class, our dear friend, our member of our choir, even sometimes during the pandemic, to be with us again today. He's only about a little more than about 7.5 months late. Because the series that he's going to start today was scheduled to begin on March 15th, 2 days after the national emergency and we shut down. Jim, I'm sure, dusted off his notes, and we're for those who don't know Jim's background, he is an ordained Presbyterian pastor, having served in congregations. He's also 22 years was a professor of religion at King College in Bristol, Tennessee, and we are so glad that he found Memphis and Idlewild his home. Jim, welcome and thank you. Jim, you may need to unmute.
There we go. Good morning, all. First thing, I hope you have a Bible, at least a New Testament, with you. If not, you can escape your screen for a moment and grab one. As Rick said, this was originally planned for back in the spring. Images of discipleship in the New Testament, and what I was thinking at the time was this would be something of a Lenten series. Well, we're well beyond Lent, and but we are certainly under a discipline right now, aren't we? Not one we anticipated, not one we chose, but we are in a certain discipline. And so I think the series of images of discipleship, because the word disciple and the word discipline are from the same word. They carry a disciplined person as a disciple. A disciple is one who is disciplined. And as I began to put this series together, I was thinking about how many different ways, first beginning with Jesus, but then the rest of the New Testament writers, particularly Paul, but he's not the only one by any means, use images to encourage us. And I really think that's what Lent ought to be about. I know that Lent, which we Presbyterians are relatively new to, at least something that's been emphasized really only in the last 30 or 40 years, for maybe even less than that for some of us. Lent is thought of as a season of repentance or penitence, but I think it really ought to be more a season of where the emphasis is on encouragement. And the images of discipleship in the New Testament, in the main, not exclusively, but in the main, I think fall on that side of the idea. Why should we be disciplined? I mean, we think of that word discipline, and sometimes it can have something of a negative character to it. It's discipline your children, and which carries with it something of a negative character. But it's by no means only negative. And I was thinking, this came to mind last week during Professor Gray's presentation as he was winding up with the book of Hebrews. And the great image that's used there in chapter 13, I think it is, beginning of 12, or maybe it's 12, where he talks about the great cloud of witnesses that is watching us. And the image there, and we're going to come back to that, is running a race in a stadium, and the stadium is filled with people cheering you on. Wonderful image that the Hebrews writer uses there, which is certainly an image of encouragement. And Paul also uses some physical images or metaphors as well. And we'll consider those on down the way. But all of that is to say is there are a lot of different ways in which the New Testament writers draw from other aspects of life images to help us in our Christian life and in our Christian discipline. And so whether it be Lent or whether it be during COVID, or for that matter, any time, I think it's worthy of our consideration. I want to begin with a very short story, and I want you to think. Today, what I'm going to do is deal primarily with some background. We're going to have five sessions together. Today, and then a week from today, and 2 weeks from today, and then we're going to have a 2-week break because there are two other things happening: the Sunday before Thanksgiving and the Sunday after Thanksgiving. I think that's right. And then so we'll pick up for 2 more Sundays after that. You'll get info on that. But anyway, I want to start with a brief story, very brief. This is from N.T. Wright's book, The Revolution, The Day the Revolution Began. And he records this story. A Roman Catholic bishop, and I've tried to find out who he is, but without success, described how 3 young lads, mischievous young lads, decided to play a trick on the priest who was hearing confessions in their local church. They took turns going into the confessional and, quote unquote, confessing all sorts of terrible sins and crimes to see how the priest would react. Two of them then made off in a hurry, but the priest stopped the third one, and as though taking him seriously, announced that he was going to impose a penance on him. The lad was to walk up to the far end of the church toward the figure of Jesus hanging on the cross. He was to look Jesus in the face and to say 3 times, "You did all that for me, and I don't give that much," snapping his fingers. The young man did it once. He did it a second time. And then he found he couldn't do it the third time, but instead dissolved into tears. He left the church a changed person. And the reason I know that story, concluded the Archbishop, is I was that young man. Now, I tell that story because we believe that Jesus Christ makes an impact. He makes a decisive impact in the world and upon us. And we all need to be reminded of the freshness, I think, that is Jesus. Especially in difficult times, but any time we need to be reminded of that. That Jesus Christ makes a difference, a decisive difference. And I would like you, in the time that we have here in these next few weeks, if there's a short little story like that you find in your reading or you know from previous reading that you could bring and share with the class, I really encourage you to do that. And I think one of the reasons that the New Testament, the Bible, gives us these different images of discipleship is because just one isn't good enough. If everyone will turn to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, and the 1st chapter. And by the way, if you need a cup of coffee, I used to tell my students in my 8 o'clock New Testament class, I said, you can bring coffee, you can bring juice, you can bring a ham sandwich, whatever it takes, as long as it keeps you awake. Well, I feel the same way as we are at home ensconced. Mark 1, familiar passage, verse 16, Mark 1:16. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will make you fishers of men." At once they left their nets and followed him. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired men and followed him. I start with that because we're starting with Jesus. And the first image of discipleship that we encounter is this summons to follow. And if we know, when we look at not only this text, but we look at it in the other Gospels as well, that there's a bit more going on than what Mark tells us. They had some familiarity with Jesus before Jesus just appeared on the edge of the shore. But Mark's point, again, is something like the story that I read, that Jesus comes in and he makes a decisive impact, and it's unforgettable and life-changing. And it's this summons to follow. So that's where I want to start, first of all, with this idea of what it is to follow and what it is to be a disciple. And I want to give you some background on that. In one sense, what Jesus did in calling disciples was not entirely new. The word disciple, our English word disciple, and with it the corollary discipline, come from the same word, or are translated from the same word, and it essentially means literally to follow, because that's what disciples of rabbis in the first century and somewhat before did. But disciples, that is, that term didn't just apply to religious following. It could be a political following. It could be a philosophical following. If you were a philosopher and you had disciples. And but it carries with it that there is a leader, and one submits to that leader to learn and to do, and to, at least to some degree, imitate. And that has both similarity and difference with what we learn when it comes to Jesus. The follow me is also interesting because physically, when a rabbi would walk, his disciples were behind him, typically. Depending on his age, he might have someone aiding him, but typically a follower or a group of followers would literally be behind the rabbi and follow him. So there's a literal aspect to this as well. Of course, it's much deeper than that. And when it comes to Jesus and disciples in his day, there are similarities and differences. For one thing, in the text that we read here, we see Jesus appearing and calling disciples. That's a difference from typical rabbis in the ancient world. And of course, that's how Jesus was initially addressed, as a teacher or as a rabbi. Rabbis didn't typically do that. If you wanted to study with a rabbi, you went and, as it were, sought him out. The rabbi didn't seek you out. You went and saw him out. And you attached yourself to him in some way of commitment and literal financial support. But Jesus, in calling the first disciples, did not do that. That is, he didn't do what was typical. He sought these people out. And you have to wonder, what was Jesus looking for when he sought these original disciples out, or those that he called to be disciples? And you remember that on a few occasions, people came to Jesus and asked to be his disciples, and Jesus rebuffed them. Think of the rich young ruler, or think of the fellow, I've got someone to bury. I've got some land to sell. And in other words, everybody, at least at that time, that is in Jesus' ministry, who for whatever reasons decided they wanted to follow Jesus, didn't necessarily get a good reception by that. But that's relates to something else that we'll come back to. So this is the first thing that we want to notice about Jesus calling disciples. And you say, well, why are you going into all of this now? What does this have to do with all of these images? I think it has to do with the fact that as disciples, we're all different. I can't be a disciple for you. You can't be a disciple for me. We each have to be a disciple in relation to God and Jesus Christ. Martin Luther once said, every Christian must believe for himself, because sooner or later every Christian must die by himself. So there's a there's a distinct aspect to this calling, and it comes to us in different ways. I think one question that we maybe we do ask ourselves, or we certainly should ask ourselves from time to time, is why do I continue to follow Jesus? Why do I do that? And these images that we're going to look at, in a way, get at maybe some particular aspect that hooks us in, that still draws us in, that no other person can satisfy the way that Jesus does. And so that's why I think these images, as we will get to them, are important. So this is the first thing about Jesus and disciples. He called his first disciples, and for instance, in John 15, he says, "You did not choose me, I chose you." So there was an intentionality about what Jesus did in terms of calling the original 12. But of course, those are not by any means the only people that ended up following Jesus or even followed him at the time. But they did follow him in a distinct way. When Jesus called those disciples, he was calling them to leave their livelihoods and their families. In other words, it was kind of an all or nothing deal, at least for the most part. Not everybody did. That is, not everybody who began to follow Jesus and believed in him and went to listen to him did that or even had to do that. Think of Mary and Martha. They were followers of Jesus, but they didn't necessarily do what the original 12 did, because, well, for a number of different reasons, but they would be representative of people that supported Jesus, believed in Jesus, or were trying to believe in Jesus and come to an understanding of him, but they didn't have to, as it were, pick up and leave and do what the original 12 did. So that's an important aspect as well. A second aspect of Jesus in terms of these calling of disciples was when Jesus called them, it was evident in one sense that he was calling them to something distinct and unusual. Jesus was not like any other rabbi. And when you read the Gospels, you see that again and again and again. He, not simply in what he teaches on many occasions, which, as the Gospel writers are frequent to say, and this amazed the crowds. Well, your typical rabbi of the day didn't amaze the crowds. They may have proved interesting, they may have proved profitable, they may have proved worthy of your listening to, but they didn't come off the same way that Jesus did. We certainly see that. And Jesus put an edge on his calling of these original disciples, and by implication, others too, that what you're doing is dangerous. It may cost you your life, literally. And of course, we can think of, those places where Jesus perhaps speaks in something of a metaphorical way. Anyone who would come after me, which is to follow me, anyone who would follow me must lay down their life, must deny themselves, take up their cross, take up their noose, take up their electric chair, their means of execution, and come and follow me. That's not a real winning billboard strategy. Come and follow me and die. But of course, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, when Jesus calls a man, he bids him come and die. Now, there's an image, that you might say certainly has a darker side to it. And yet, at the same time that it has this foreboding, this darker side, certainly a serious side to it, it has an intriguing dimension to it. Is following Jesus really worth your life? Again, that's a good question that we need to revisit from time to time. So here are these men, and of course they were all men, these are that is the original 12, who are called and who respond to this call that is both exciting in one way, but what are we getting into in another? I think that, you know, in our time, we have the luxury, you know, in one sense, of growing up as Christians and growing up in church, perhaps in growing up with parents that taught us well, or somewhere along the way somebody did. But our life is not literally on the line. What is that like? You know, none of us really know that, where our life is literally on the line. There are places in the world where it is. That is where that is a real factor, where those words of Jesus still have the edge to them that for us, not so much. And so how do we recapture something of that? And that's a real challenge, I think, for us. And if we do recapture some element of that, that is that our life is on the line, what does that look like? Because nobody's going to come after us, at least not for the foreseeable future, I would wager, because we are Christians. So how do we recapture something of that element? What does that mean? And I don't have the answer for that. I mean, I don't think there is an answer. Maybe we have to each find a way that helps us do that, though. But the images that we're going to revisit, that we're going to visit, I think try to get at that. They try to get at that element of the moment of being a disciple and the excitement of being a disciple of Jesus. And so the third thing I would say in terms of this understanding of what Jesus was calling the original disciples to do was rabbis of Jesus' day were really teaching certain interpretations of the law. Everything pertained to the law, how you applied it, and that really was you might say, the question of the day. What is it to be a Jew? What is it to follow the law in our day? What does that mean in a world in which the Romans, the pagans, rule? In which there are, depending on where you lived, all sorts of competing philosophies, and not so much political points of view, but at least not. I mean, Rome was Rome. Rome ruled, but political points of view and what ought to be. How ought the world? How ought we to live? And certainly that was a very Jewish concern of the day. How does one be a good Jew in this world as it is? But Jesus wasn't calling people to that as a rabbi. It became more and more clear in Jesus' teaching that what Jesus was calling his disciples to was himself. I am the way. See, the law was called the way. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The law gave life in the Jewish understanding of the ancient world. The law was true over against the infidelities of the pagan world. The law gave life. It sprung from God. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Come to me and take my yoke. And you see, the law was called the yoke of the law. It's still used in Jewish parlance today. When you are bar mitzvahed, or if you're a female, bat mitzvahed, you take the yoke of the law upon yourself. And Jesus uses that image to speak, I am the yoke. It becomes, in Jesus's ministry with these disciples, that he is the center of his teaching. It's very often, when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, of course, the overarching theme of Jesus' teaching is about the kingdom. His parables are about the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like, a man who went out to sow. And even if he doesn't mention the kingdom per se, it's implied in so much of what he does have to say. Something is happening in the moment. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The kingdom of God is at hand. The reign of God is breaking in. That's what John the Baptist said. Jesus echoes it with even more urgency. And so in the Synoptic Gospels, it's sort of like Jesus speaks in the third person about himself in terms of the kingdom. You get over to John's Gospel, and it's very explicit. I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the gate, you see. John makes explicit in his Gospel, in the teaching of Jesus, what is more implicit in the Synoptic Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Which is why John reads so differently. Or that's one of the reasons that John's Gospel reads so differently. John is trying to make overt what is so often covert. John makes overt in his Gospel what is often covert in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Which again makes the way the gospel writers wrote just all the more fascinating, what they're getting at here. So that being said, anybody got a question that they'd like to raise? Raise your hand or a comment. And you'll need to unmute if you have something you want to say.
We have a note from the chat from Jim and Claire. Instead of losing our life, maybe losing our wealth would be more of a risk for us. But anyone else?
Again, this is correct. You've referenced several verses, with some really hard commandments. Laying down your life, taking up the cross, giving up your wealth, and the one that's always gotten me, and maybe it's in a later class you've planned, but it's from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, be perfect. The God in heaven is perfect. Do you see that as aspirational or a commandment?
Yes. That's a great, I hadn't thought of that. Thank you for pointing that out. We'll come back to that. Because if there are, Jesus can be troublesome. But wouldn't you expect him to be? I heard someone say, I can't remember who it was some time ago, if Jesus came into the world to do all he intended to do, you do think it's going to interrupt your life, don't you? Well, yeah, I guess it will. Because we have various things in mind, and they don't necessarily line up with what Jesus has in mind. So thank you for pointing that out, and we will come back to it. So don't let me forget it. But I had not thought of that particular. So and so any other kind of verse like that where Jesus is, you know, and remember when Jesus says things like that, the disciples must have thought very similarly. Same things. Reacted very similarly in the same way we do. Jesus, are you serious? Are you serious? And so we have to say, yeah, but how? And you know, from Jim and Claire, losing our wealth instead of our life. Well, yeah, but how? How much? What do you mean by that? Because certainly in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts, but we see it reflected in the letters too, that not all the followers of Jesus, you know, did exactly what these disciples had to do. And the implication is that they didn't have to. But what did that mean, and what did that look like if they too were if they were taking seriously these commands of Jesus, you know, to take up the cross, to sell what you have and give to the poor? What did that look like? You know, how realistic was that? So yeah, those are all really good observations, and I hope, you know, this raises piques not only your interest, but you know, raises questions like that. Anybody else before we deal with one other subject before we close out?
Minna.
Yes, Minna, unmute.
I have been involved in interfaith dialogue all of my adult life. And I know a lot of Muslims, I know Jews, Hindus, the Baha'i, and I come to Jesus because I get what he says. Love God with all your heart and mind and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a pretty broad-based commandment drawn really from his commandment. And I think that gives us a little bit of leeway. If I can't lay down my life, at least I can help, you know, I can work toward economic justice. I would say that's the Christian following for me. Even though there's a lot of people that Jesus is never said, that
Yeah. And you know, if we were committed to that, if we actually did that more consistently, the world would certainly be a lot better off. And you know, it's you remember what Jesus said to the Pharisee, you know, when he asked him, what is the sum of the law? That is, what's the law all about? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, you ain't far from the kingdom. That's right. That's what things are about here. Yeah. So, yeah, well said. Another thing I wanted to point out about in terms of, so here's the other way I want to go in the remaining time that we have here. In the ministry, during the ministry of Jesus, that is that which is that time which is reflected in the Gospels, you can speak of four kinds of disciples, four, you might say, circles or levels of disciples, and I'm going to work from the inside and out. First of all, we notice that among the 12, there are three in particular that seem to be, sometimes they're referred to as Jesus' inner circle: Peter, James, and John. They are with Jesus in a few very special moments. For instance, when Jesus goes in to heal the daughter of Jairus, he only takes with him Peter, James, and John. Now, Is that because there's only room for so many? But still, he chooses those three. On the Mount of Transfiguration, who is with Jesus when that event takes place? Who is it that hears the words from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him"? It's Peter, James, and John. These three, for whatever reasons, are interesting in and of themselves because we by and large know what happened to them. Of course, Peter among the three stands out in one sense because he's always shooting his mouth off, usually in the right direction. If not, he kills flies with sledgehammers sometimes, but at least he's on the right track, though sometimes Jesus has to set him straight. But of course, he lived a relatively long life, and according to tradition, would die in Rome in the circus there, crucified upside down. That's according to tradition. I don't know if you know or not, but there in St. Peter's Square, where the obelisk is right in the middle there, that supposedly marks the turn in the circus where the horses ran. Now that wasn't the great chariot where the chariot races were, but it was one place, and supposedly, at least according to tradition, that's where Peter was crucified. But more importantly, is Peter certainly a lead disciple, and we know essentially what happens to him. James, of this James and John, because there were a couple of them, is the James that is put to death by Herod Agrippa I about 44 A.D., and apparently for his church leadership in Jerusalem. Though it was James, the brother of Jesus, that apparently was kind of the president, if we want to use that word, or the moderator of the General Assembly of the church in Jerusalem, if we want to use some Presbyterian parlance. But apparently lived played an effective role in the early church in Jerusalem, and then is put to death by Herod Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great. And then John, to whom we attribute the contents of the gospel and perhaps the three letters, and some would even say the book of Revelation, is the only disciple, at least according to tradition, that does not die a martyr's death, but lived and died somewhere in the vicinity of Ephesus toward the end of the 1st century A.D. So here was someone that, here was one of the original 12 that, did not literally die a death as a martyr, as the other two did. So that tells us something about, when Jesus talks about anyone who would come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There is a metaphorical element to that, though the possibility of death is a real thing, and we'll talk more about that as well. So we have this inner circle of disciples that perhaps in some sense Jesus depended upon in a more intimate way than he does the other 12, who sometimes are mentioned for this and that. Think of Matthew and Thomas, or Bartholomew or Nathaniel. We think that's the same person. But anyway, they stand out among the 12, who then, who I mentioned a moment ago, the 12 are called to leave their families and their livelihoods and go and follow Jesus. And you have to realize that for them to do that, Jesus' own family during most of his ministry thought he was nuts. The brothers did. I don't know what the sisters thought. I mean, here is Jesus. He's the head of the family. He's the eldest son. He's taken over the family. He's the head of the family business there in Nazareth. And then this prophet down in the south, he hears about, and he picks up and leaves, and he's gone. I mean, normal people don't do that. And so Jesus was a disgrace in Nazareth. You remember what happens when he comes back, according to Luke, and reads from Isaiah in the synagogue there. Local boy makes good? No, local boy, we want to kill him. So, you can imagine when these other people, these original 12, left their families to go follow this another prophet, really? What's he selling? We can imagine that their families were not too happy either, for the most part, in general. So you have these original 12 who, again, Jesus commits to. They commit to him, but he commits to them too. We need to remember that. And for what we think of as more or less a 3-year ministry. The third group is a larger group of disciples that are seriously interested in Jesus. They're people like Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And we would know of others who, when Jesus is in the area, they go and hear him. They support him, perhaps financially. We know that the women did this in particular. When he's in the neighborhood, they listen to him, and they are taking him seriously, and they're waiting for more to happen. Because Jesus doesn't ask them to come and do what the 12 are doing. There is a distinction here, because Jesus' ministry at that time is more or less a peripatetic, around Galilee, down into Judea occasionally, movement. And these people, they have lives and families and work, and they continue with those. But they are seriously interested in Jesus, and in that sense, they can be referred to as disciples. They're listening, and they're waiting for more to happen, because that's what we need to remember with the ministry of Jesus. It isn't static. Jesus hasn't come along to just teach a new way of understanding the law. He has come because of who he is and what he is going to do. And there is to be more afterwards. In fact, as Jesus says, you will do greater works than me. So there's an anticipation of what Jesus, there is an anticipation implied and sometimes clearly spoken of in terms of what Jesus is doing. There's a sense in which what Jesus is doing is preparatory only. It's to launch something, but the launching hasn't taken off just yet. But the preparation for that, the stirring of the pot, if I may use that metaphor, for this new movement. And that's what's involved here. It is a new movement that they are being called to, that is centered in this person of Jesus. And then the fourth level, and here we're using the term disciples very, very loosely, would be people who they don't know exactly what to do with Jesus yet. They may have some level of genuine interest. They may have some dimension in which they find this Jesus intriguing, but they're not really ready to commit just yet. They're looking at Jesus more from the outside and looking at everything else around them. And they're thinking about all they're thinking about some of the implications that of what Jesus is saying, and they're trying to weigh whether or not this fellow is worth listening to or not. Because we need to remember that in Jesus' day, Jesus wasn't the only person going around spouting religious, political, and what might be termed philosophical teaching, you know, or as a miracle worker either. There were Jewish and there were pagan miracle workers that went around, you know, selling their trade. We bump into some of them in the book of Acts, for instance, both Jewish and pagan. So for people who are not yet that close to listening to Jesus seriously, or in that in-between state, they're still trying to decide whether or not Jesus is worth listening to or not. So they're not technically disciples yet, but they are certainly there, and whoever is within the hearing of Jesus, you know, you might say, would fall into that fourth category of discipleship, although we're using that in a very loose sense. So that's where I think we'll stop today. Not really trying to conclude anything so much as to more or less just give you some background and to raise some questions. Hopefully I've raised some questions. Again, to remind you, maybe through this week or in the weeks to come, if there's something that stands out in the Gospels, a verse like Rick picked out to consider, or a particular short story or illustration about how Jesus has hooked you or helps hook you in one sense. You know, Jesus said to Peter, I'll make you a fisher of men, I'm a fisher of persons. Well, of course, Jesus was already doing that. He hooked Peter. He hooked the fisherman himself. And in one sense, you know, to use that metaphor, hopefully we've all been hooked. But we need to keep on being hooked. Again, since this is Reformation, or last Sunday, I guess, was technically Reformation Sunday, but yesterday was October 31, as Martin Luther said, I need to be born again every day because I forget the gospel every day. And with that, we'll close. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Right.
I'm always grateful for your being.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us for the next on again, off again weeks ahead. Weeks ahead.
All right. Before everybody leaves, you will have gotten an email from Ann telling you that church this morning will be on the church's YouTube page, which is not live stream for technical reasons that we don't need to get into, because they're not broadcasting from the sanctuary. They've put it together all online. So you go to youtube.com/user/idlewildprez, or I'm going to paste it in the chat. And there's also links in the email that you will have gotten. So how you can get to church service this Sunday. It's going to post at probably about 11:15, maybe a little bit before, maybe a little after, because it's not live. They will have recorded everything and put it together. So that's where church is. And Ann's email also has a new link to the revised bulletin to match this. So they've asked us to tell you this also in Sunday school.
Thank you, Daniel. And to everyone, go in peace. May God be with you. We'll see you next week.
Jim, can you and Rick stay in this meeting for a few minutes?
Sure.
Sure.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Jim. Wrong Jim.
Yeah, Jim Lavernier, you can go. It's okay.
Thank you. Bye.